So our first speakers is Sarah and Carrie. Sarah is an anti-militarist campaigner and activist trainer based in Brussels, with Ajifulape. She has been campaigning against the arms trade for over 10 years and works to show the links between the arms trade and other issues like border militarization, climate change, extractivism, and policing. And Carrie, she's a racial justice campaigning working on the intersection of race and imperialism. So yeah, I give the floor to Sarah and Carrie to start with their presentation.
Thanks, Natalia. So we thought we'd do this as a little Q&A between Carrie and I, as we're a buddy pair. So I'm going to start by asking Carrie, as someone who's new to the peace movement, what has brought you into this space and what made you want to get involved?
Thanks so much, Sarah. And yeah, hi to everyone. I feel really, really privileged to be in this space, especially considering the audience where everyone's from around the world. I think to understand why I've decided to join the peace movement quite recently is to kind of understand what's been happening with the US and China, or rather, what the US has been imposing on China in the past decade. The best way I like to tell this story is to really talk about my experience during COVID-19. So when COVID-19 hit, some very old racist tropes were reinvigorated. I think a lot of people may have seen this. We saw clips of these East Asian people eating really strange foods like bats being circulated around the internet and being blamed for the cause of the virus. These conspiracy theories about Wuhan labs from China, legitimately actually pushed by quite a few governments and even in newspapers. And all of a sudden, I just saw cemented these just centuries old tropes of either these dirty Oriental people with backwards customs causing viruses and plagues around the world, or us being these sneaky supervillains trying to, infiltrate everyone's sort of economies. And as this was happening around me and within my community, I was hearing more and more stories of hate crimes spiking, of people experiencing harassment and violence around the world. People who looked like me, Asian people, were starting to really actually feel scared in their own communities. And progressives are really quick to point out that whenever racism happens at home like this, it's because of Trump or conservatives, or it's because of the uneducated, or, people are just paranoid during COVID. But increasingly, I began to notice what was strikingly left out of this narrative was the military. And that this is actually a really calculated part of an imperialist agenda, and particularly in the US, we've seen this again and again. And sometimes whenever I say things like this, I feel really, really paranoid, or delving into conspiracy theories about the military. But since 2008, when the Obama administration left, he created this thing called the Pivot to Asia Military Strategy. And this focused billions of dollars of military spending away from the Middle East. And we can see this happening now towards Asia. The US empire clearly had this new target, and it was China. It was me, my family, and the people that I love and know. And I think in the past decade, and this is really ramped up during COVID-19, security companies dressed up as think tanks, funding think tanks, began to peddle hysterical news about China. It began to dominate mainstream media without any critique. So I think people may have been able to hear some of these, may have heard some of these things. China is seeking debt trap diplomacy, with Africa. China has a social credit system and ranks all their people based on that. China, is developing this virus in a shady lab. And if you speak any Mandarin and follow any Chinese politics within its plurality and its complexities, these things are just not true at all. This is all military and imperialist propaganda. And all of a sudden, human rights abuses in China became laser focused on by mainstream media and colonial governments. I saw the UK, France, Belgium, Germany, and even the EU, who generally don't really give a shit about human rights. Let's be honest, particularly in the global South, where they've dominated and destroyed human rights and development, suddenly all started piling onto this China discourse. And I could just see this narrative started to walk hand in hand with the US State Department's objectives to justify increased military spending and boots on the ground in the Pacific. And I'm from Australia, which is like a colonial nation in the Pacific. And already our government has spent billions on dollars on like submarines and weapons, whilst calling itself the first line defenders to fight China if the US decided to get involved. And sometimes, like, when I point out these anxieties to people in the progressive movement or who don't know that much about the military, a lot of people dismiss me or like call me crazy. But like, you know, how on earth is like the military industrial complex like involved in all this stuff? But they are. And to understand that is to understand how like a core part of like capitalism is imperialism. You know, like we fight wars not because of bad foreign policy or bad governments, but because capitalism necessitates private capital and governments to go out and defend resources and their market share. You know, like Vladimir Lenin wrote about this 100 years ago, and I like highly recommend reading his work about this. It ties into everything like militarized borders and climate crisis, the underdevelopment of the global south, racism, which is what I work in a lot. And yeah, that's why I decided to step into the peace movement.
And so we actually met through the Abolish Frontex campaign. So do you want to tell us a bit about what got you excited about that?
Yeah, it's so exciting because like I think my first step into working within the peace movement is through Abolish Frontex. And what excited me about Abolish Frontex is two things. If people don't know what Frontex is an EU border force agency that works really, really closely with the military to pretty much criminalize migration all around the EU's borders, and it's led to the deaths of thousands of people. But a campaign has been created recently calling to abolish Frontex. And the two things that really excite me is like, first is the manifesto. Everyone just like has to go and read it. It really just like analyzes how migration and border force go hand in hand with the military and has like a really intersectional lens. I don't know, I've worked a lot in racial justice and migration, and for something to explicitly like talk about capitalism and colonialism just like never happens. In my years of like working in racial justice, these are like core parts that I think are really left out of our movements. And I see this also happening in some parts of the peace movement as well, especially this aspect of capitalism, how this ties to colonialism, and how this actually really like, you know, pushes further military spending around the world. And you know, as a child of migrants from the global south, I've always been reminded of how like grateful that I should be, being, you know, that I was born in Australia. You know, white people really love to tell these stories of like migrants making a new life and new opportunities in like these rich developed worlds, but you know, I actually think it's kind of fucked that we have to move. I'm sorry, I'm Australian, so I've been swearing a lot in this, but I think it's crazy that we have to move from our homelands in the first place to meet our basic needs in the global north. And the reason why, it's really because the global north took all of our resources in the first place. This was done through warfare. This was done through the military. And that's why I think it's really, really important to connect capitalism and colonialism with border force and with the military. And this really is the core of like the future of like anti-militarism work. The second thing about Abolish Frontex, which I think everyone should have a look at and get involved with, is that it's like a decentralized campaign with one unifying goal. And I just think that's really powerful because, you know, anyone who agrees with the campaign can organize in their own communities with their own tactics to abolish Frontex. It can be as small as like putting up stickers in your neighborhoods with groups of people as big as, or something as big as direct action to like stop deportation. I think that sometimes there's a lot of like sadness and like inertia in our movements, considering how many people have died as a result of Fortress Europe. And if we consider how Frontex or like even the military has the money, we need to have people power. And the primary goal of a good campaign that will win has to center this strategy. It's got to invest in people. It's got to invest in leadership within people's own communities, people's creativity, you know, people's desire to do more and have more connections to one another. It's not some like NGO. It's not just about signing petitions. That's the power of like a decentralized campaign, and that's what makes Abolish Frontex really exciting.
Great. And finally, so you started talking about mobilizing, the difference between organizing and mobilizing. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah, like I think one of the things that the peace movement can really, really take, but all movements can really take, is to kind of, in order to build better power for the long term, is to like recognize the key difference between organizing and mobilizing. Right now, a lot of our movements really invest in mobilizing. So that's when you try to bring as many people together for one action. It could be a protest, it could be mobilizing to sign a petition, it could be sending an email to, you know, one of your legislators. And there are many reasons why we focus on mobilizing. It's quicker, it's easier. The way that funding models work, like, necessitates, organizations to mobilize. Capitalist metrics of measurements means it's the work that gets focused on. But often people just come to actions as individuals, and like they'll leave as individuals. No community is built, or like greater long-term connection. And I think organizing is something that builds these connections, right? Like, an organizing model is something that really invests in building these connections. And it really, like, the way that I've seen organizing run is good organizers really invest in new leadership. It focuses on people taking on those leadership positions, organizing new leaders when they are getting mobilized, and training them to organize in their own communities, to connect and build leadership within their own communities. And the future of anti-militarism, to really sustain our work, has to be focused on organizing and this type of capacity building in the future. And yeah, that's why I find organizing, around Frontex really exciting. And that's how we're going to win. Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. And so I've got a few questions for Sarah as well. I feel as if Sarah's like a little bit of my like mentor within like coming into the peace movement, and there's so much to learn from her. So my first question to you is, like, you've just been involved against the arms trade for a decade. I want to know, like, what got you involved, and from then, what have you actually learned within it?
Thanks, Carrie. And I'm also asking Natalia how we're doing on time to not go over.
Yeah, I think you have like 8-10 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. So yeah, I first got involved in anti-arms trade campaigning because for me, it really represented everything that's wrong with the current economic system. So this was in the context of the 2007 economic crisis, and I was living in England at the time. And the UK government was making huge cuts to public spending and services like healthcare and welfare, while continuing to heavily subsidize the arms industry. And frankly, I was just disgusted by, as you also mentioned in your talk, the UK, but also the European Union's hypocrisy and also audacity in talking about human rights while continuing to export weapons to countries at war and repressing their populations, but also given the violence, injustice, and environmental destruction that the UK and the EU have inflicted on the world historically and today. And those reasons for getting involved in the arms trade, anti-arms trade campaigning haven't changed. And I think this is one of the things I keep going on about, is we really need to be seeing the role that militarism plays in keeping this economic system in place. But also we need to be seeing the role that the arms industry plays in defining the concept of security, and whose security are we talking about, and whose lives are considered disposable. And we really saw this in Brussels when the COVID pandemic hit Europe. Not only did it kind of lay bare the impact of years of austerity politics and the complete decimation and privatization of national health services, but also the impacts of, globalized trade and unjust trade relations. And so as European governments were scrambling to respond to the crisis and to provide enough hospital beds and staff and protective equipment, I think it became really obvious, even to people uncritical of militarism, that the concept of security and being safe, isn't keeping us safe. And it was so interesting because the arms industry really sensed this. So as the pandemic hit Europe, I started Googling the sort of Brussels media, which is aimed at EU decision makers. And in March 2020, articles started appearing written by arms industry executives and high-level decision makers who were sensing a possible threat to their funding and relevance, were publishing these articles saying, yes, there's a global health crisis, but that doesn't mean you should cut military budgets. And we as an arms industry can be really useful in dealing with this pandemic. So I think what we saw in 2020 is the arms industry pushing for increased military spending, despite the kind of very obvious need, to deal with this health crisis. Which is unsurprising because it's the arms trade that profits from this. So that's another kind of focus of the work that I've been doing, is showing the role of the arms industry lobby and the sort of corporate power and how it's influencing the EU and also member states. And through sort of extreme lobbying, I would say, and its close relationship with European governments and institutions, the arms trade is pushing a securitization of different issues. So whether we're talking about climate change, migration, civil unrest and protest, or a health pandemic, the arms industry frames these issues as threats which require a militarized response. And obviously, the arms companies are the ones who are placed to, provide the solutions. And this kind of lobbying from the arms industry, it worked, despite, everything we're facing in the world, from, runaway climate change to this health crisis. Last year, the European Parliament approved a 7.9 billion euro European Defence Fund. This is a fund completely dedicated to military research. We saw several countries like France, Germany, Norway, and Spain, including the arms industry in their COVID economic recovery plans. The United Kingdom announced its biggest increase in military spending since 70 years. So despite the global pandemic and the urgent need to tackle things like climate change, this growing inequality, people who are being killed every day at Europe's borders, and the conflicts that are still being fueled by European weapons, military spending hasn't suffered. So I think as movements, we really need to be countering this militarization of issues and calling for radical social change. And we need to be calling for our governments to be investing in real security and safety, meaning, welfare, housing, transitioning to a low carbon economy, and other, public services. Sorry, that was quite a lot.
Oh, that was amazing. I feel as if, we're up against a lot, and this has been an ongoing sort of fight, and I just wonder, in your experience, how have you seen how we sustain our resistance against this? And how do we keep organizing when the world's a mess and there's so much that we feel as if we need to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it's really easy to feel overwhelmed, and I speak from my own experience in the context that I'm in. But when we start seeing militarism in its entirety, and also just like you say, everything we're up against, it's where do we start, and how do we feel like we're having an impact? So I do think one of the most important things we need to be doing is looking back and honoring and recognizing and taking time to see the changes where they are happening, and to celebrate these successes. And I think one of the most inspiring things from the last couple of years has been, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and following George Floyd's murder, seeing the sort of very real changes that happen. And obviously, police abolition and the fight against institutional racism, generations of struggle. But I think what we saw was a sort of watershed moment where, when change happens, things can happen very quickly. So, for example, we saw in Halifax, Canada, councillors voting not to buy an armoured vehicle for their police, and instead spending the money on diversity and inclusion and fighting racism. We saw the Minneapolis City Council proposing to dismantle the city's police department. And here in Europe, we saw a kind of toppling of colonial statues, which I think in many places, such as Portugal, where I grew up, for the first time, there were media articles coming out about how Portugal needs to reckon with its colonial past. And I think looking at the arms industry, for example, we saw governments in the US, Europe, but also South Africa calling on arms companies to switch to manufacturing ventilators and hospital equipment to try and help deal with the pandemic. And I feel like if these companies can be producing socially useful technology during a pandemic, maybe they can continue afterwards. We also saw, for example, Portugal regularizing migrants so they could access healthcare. And it's like, if European governments can give people rights that that everyone has a right to during a pandemic, they should do this afterwards. And the research is there in terms of transitioning away from military, from arms production. And this was really, I think, the context that the Abolish Frontex campaign came about, that you've already talked about. It was really an attempt to not design a campaign that was, politically strategic or single issue, or what do we think, what demands can be met, in our lifetime, but really setting out with what is everything we see that is wrong with the EU's border regime and border militarization, and what is the kind of society that we want to build. And very much inspired by the police abolition work in the States, it was an attempt to set out concrete steps that governments can take right now to try and change the system. Because I think often when we talk about peace, or when we talk about abolition, we can come across as utopian, or, but we need a border force. And it's like, actually, the Abolish Frontex campaign is really trying to challenge that at its root. I think I should probably stop there because I could keep going, but maybe just to say that, there's been such huge worldwide organizing and uprisings in places like Chile, Colombia, India, the Gilets jaunes in France, and just I feel very, very inspired by seeing the sort of the globalized struggle against the system.
Yeah, that's so exciting. Sometimes when I participate in these movements, it often feels like we're ironically recreating these structures that we're fighting against, patriarchy, oppression. And I'm wondering, how do we overcome that within our movements to really just keep our movements going for the long term, especially with things like Abolish Frontex?
Yeah, thanks. And I was listening to the plenary from last weekend when Rosa was talking about burnout and the need for community care. And I really think that one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in the groups and organizations I've worked with, and also with myself, is chronic burnout and a sort of a deep internalization of the system we're trying to transform. And I think the two are very much linked. I think when I started organizing, we didn't talk about burnout or emotional resilience, or even just the impact of direct action and facing up to the military or taking action against the arms trade. A few years in, it would be a one-by-one case of, oh, this person is experiencing burnout. And now I feel like within my circle, it's hard to find people who aren't, whether not in the spectrum of burnout, but feeling really depleted, low on energy, or in despair. And the pandemic hasn't helped with this. And I think one of the things that I've experienced is, despite groups being critical of capitalism and the system, it's almost like we've internalized the values and ways of operating so deeply that we're reproducing this in our spaces. And I'm talking very much from a Western European context, because that's where I've worked and organized. But for example, I see groups evaluating campaigns or actions based on things like constant growth, and valuing output and productivity and efficiency, rather than process and trust building and relationships, or treating, group members or activists as disposable or replaceable, or, for example, organizing actions because we need an instant reaction to the atrocities that are happening, rather than actually taking the time to think about, what would a strategic response be, and also to honor those feelings of despair and grief at what's happening. So I think I would say another big part of my work in recent years has been more of this trying to build resilience, repair the damage that this system is doing in terms of the, destroying social fabric and relationships and isolating people, and trying to organize more in cycles and respecting, we're not, that social change is not a constant linear growth, but it comes in cycles, and it's natural to have downtimes, and it's natural to have conflicts and tensions within our groups. And it's what do we do with that, and how do we nourish ourselves and our spaces? And I think I've probably gone over time.
I've got like so many other questions to ask you, but we'll leave it there.